Hey students, this is Mr. Moore, and I'm here with your Week 2 notes for U.S. Government class, a senior level class that's required for graduation in the state of California. Today I'm going to be talking about rights and responsibilities of citizens in a democracy. Again, I like to ask an essential question when I give my notes, so it kind of gives us some direction, a place to go, a direction to go. And by the end of it, you should be able to understand the essential question and a lot more. What does the motto of the U.S. really mean? I don't know if you know this, but our country has a motto. It's printed on our coins, it's printed on our official symbols, and the motto is E pluribus unum. It's a Latin phrase. Latin is the language of the old Romans, and that is a Latin phrase. People who were educated, especially back in the 1700s and even 1800s, and going way back, 16, 15, 1400s, were schooled in Latin. And again, Latin was the language of the Romans. So this goes all the way back to the year zero, right? E pluribus unum. It stands for out of many, one. Out of many, one, or in many, one. And so it's talking about us coming together. And the United States is a diversified place. And I think that's going to be one of my midterm questions right there. E pluribus unum. And what does it mean? Out of many comes one. And you'll find that all over the place as you start to become familiar with it. You'll see it in lots of different places. Patriotism is supporting your country all the time, and your government when it deserves it. I like that. Mark Twain was a smart guy. He's pretty famous for authoring books, Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, and being a political activist in the United States, 1800s. Patriotism is supporting your country all the time. I love the United States of America, but I don't always love the government, and I don't always want to give my support to it because sometimes it doesn't deserve it. And so I think that's brilliant and beautiful, and I think there is a great difference. We have to separate those two things and understand it. So what does it mean to be a citizen? What I want to talk about is maybe a little bit of a background as to some of the things that were laid out to kind of help develop these ideas of citizens' rights and having a government that is restrictive and restricted. Back in medieval times, I don't mean to give too much of a history lesson here, but sometimes in a government class we do have to address history. If we go all the way back to the year zero, right now, if we're in the year 2020, that is 2020 years. Sometimes in my history classes, I like to ask that question, why? Why is it the year 2020? In other words, what happened 2020 years ago that was so significant that our entire concept of time is based on that very fact? And I like to teach my history classes that 2020 years ago, Jesus was born. So whether you're a Christian or not, the entire idea of the date that we use all the time, every day, on our cell phone, on our computer, on our calendars, that date is based on a Christian event. And it was, started by the Romans, who used a Julian calendar. And then in the 1500s, the Pope actually switched it over to what we call the Gregorian calendar. And it tries to take into account all the anomalies that happen in the real world. And we get to the modern time where we have the dates and systems now. But after the fall of Rome, which happened around 400 AD, okay, a Latin phrase, Anno Domini, the year of the Lord, around 400 AD, the Roman Empire collapsed. And we get into this time period in history called the Dark Ages, sometimes called the Middle Ages or medieval times. And during that time, governments in Europe were run on a system of feudalism. And it was almost a fear that people were scared, and because they had fear, they would look to powerful people to protect them. And so they were willing to give up a lot of freedoms in order to have their fears pacified. So they would give loyalty, fidelity, right, to a landlord, a noble, a king, in return for protection. And so the system of feudalism was very pervasive during the Dark Ages, medieval times, Middle Ages. And slowly after that time, over the last 500 years, we've had a development of democracy. And the first document that a lot of people will point to that actually limited the powers of a king or a ruler was called the Magna Carta. And so that definitely goes back to medieval times. The year is 1215. That's 1,215 years since the birth of Jesus. 1215 AD, Anno Domini. That's a Latin phrase. A document that limits the power of the king, that he must respect the laws. That Magna Carta kind of paves the way, at least in the English world, okay? And soon afterwards, they start to develop what they call a parliament. The parliament is a group of men. Today it's men and women, but back then it was a group of men, lords and nobles who had some power and were part of the feudal system, and they would share power with the king. So we go from the king having all power to sharing power with parliament, and one of the main things that parliament would do is allow the king to raise or lower taxes. People get really upset when it comes to taxes, right? And that's still one of the things that people get frustrated. It might even be the reason that we have a country, right? People were shouting the battle cry back in the 1760s and 70s, no taxation without representation, which leads to the American Revolution in the 1700s. So people have always been frustrated with taxes, and they want to know how government's going to use their money, because the government doesn't have money. It's the people's money, and the government takes it. That's taxes, right? And so the English Parliament was established so that they can control how much taxes the king was asking for. If you fast forward several hundred years, so obviously this is not so much of a history class as showing you how governments in the English world have developed, we get to a point called the English Bill of Rights. 1689. It's something that we like to refer to in 1688 as the Glorious Revolution. It's where the English Parliament actually starts to supersede the king in power. Okay? At first, the king has all power, but the Magna Carta limits it. And then they actually establish Parliament, and we start to move forward. And then the English Bill of Rights is a couple hundred years later, where people actually, the Parliament at least, starts to have more power than the king. And it's a document that starts to grant or guarantee people specific freedoms. And you see, almost 100 years later, we move into the Declaration of Independence. And remember that American history, the history of the United States, is British history until July 4th, 1776, where we sign this divorce paper to the British government, a document where we move away and we say we don't want bad government, and we're willing to replace this bad government with a government that functions better. What rights and responsibilities does a citizen have in a democracy? I'd like to review a couple of things about the American Revolution. Again, this is not a history class, but the roots of our country stem from the American Revolution. I love this flag, early flag that was used by the colonial armies, the Patriots. Don't tread on me, with that rattlesnake ready to bite. And I kind of put here a little reminder of the Sons of Liberty, the Continental Congress, and the Minutemen. If you remember some of the stuff you learned last year in U.S. history class, I hope you learned the first battle of Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill and Trenton. Trenton is where we surprised a British run, on Christmas Day, where George Washington crosses the Delaware. The Battle of Saratoga is where the French decide to start helping us, and Battle of Yorktown is the last battle of the American Revolution. The Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, Valley Forge, and the Treaty of Paris. Common Sense. These are essential documents. Common Sense by Thomas Paine. The Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4th, 1776, by Thomas Jefferson. The Articles of Confederation was the first constitution, but it didn't work very well, so we redrafted it into the constitution we use today. The Bill of Rights and the Federalist Papers. These are things you should have learned about last year. I'm not going to take time to go over the details, but I hope it's just a little refresher that you already have learned some stuff about government. Of course, the French helped us to gain our independence, and then they used a lot of the ideas of the American Revolution, which we honestly used a lot of their ideas to start the revolution, but they used theirs in the French Revolution. And, we even got that Statue of Liberty from France. Our greatest symbol of liberty is from France, right? So Lafayette and Rochambeau were some of the French dudes who came over and helped in the American Revolution. We were fighting against King George III, General Cornwallis, and maybe one of the biggest traitors in American history is Benedict Arnold, right? Some of the key ideas that prompted the American Revolution that are embedded into our idea of government: no taxation without representation, give me liberty or give me death, live free or die, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And of course, some of our founding forefathers: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. Those, by the way, are the first 4 presidents of the United States: George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Alexander Hamilton was never president because he was shot and killed in a duel with the vice president, with Thomas Jefferson's vice president. He is on the $10 bill and played a big role in our early government. Benjamin Franklin was also never president, but his face shows up on money and generally considered one of the key founders. And Samuel Adams, cousin to the president, John Adams, but he was kind of a rebel rouser and one of those sons of liberty. So, what are the key elements of a representative democracy, and how do they develop over time? The Constitution of the United States replaced the Articles of Confederation, which governed our nation from 1777 to 1787. So for 10 years, our government functioned under the Articles of Confederation. Again, I'm kind of going fast because I'm reviewing some stuff from 11th grade history that you should have learned. And if you didn't, I need you to hear these things so that you can be a functioning member of my class and participate in government and understand how government works. Because again, if you don't know how our government works, then it assumes power. It will take over. The government will become as big as we, the people, will allow it. And if we allow it, they'll take away our freedoms. There are freedoms, and it's not the right of the government to take those away. Those are our freedoms. So the Articles of Confederation was kind of a backlash from having a king that didn't give us any kind of rights. So after we signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, we wrote this Articles of Confederation. It's the exact opposite of a king. It doesn't give the government authority at all. And so it wasn't very strong or powerful, and thus it became problematic. So we replaced it starting in 1787, and we were working on it in 78, getting people to accept it. And finally, in 1789, George Washington becomes the first president under the Constitution. Before that, there was no president. So the most important document in our country is the U.S. Constitution. It's divided into 7 parts called articles. And the U.S. Constitution is a document that limits the powers of our government, and it was initiated in 1787. The U.S. Constitution shows what our government should look like and how it should work. Okay, I have some embedded videos that you're welcome to go to my website. Click on week 2 notes, and you'll find this video embedded right here. If we were in class, I'd probably pause and show the video. We'd have a little discussion. But for the purposes of recording my lecture, I'm going to go ahead and move forward. But I've embedded these videos to help you. So I encourage you to check them out. If I actually assign it, then I'll put it out as a specific assignment in Google Classroom. The Constitution starts out with something called the preamble. And I'm going to go ahead and read this word for word because it's so essential to what our beliefs about government are. And I'm sure you've heard these words before. But it says, "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." And those are bold words. And in a few weeks, I'm going to give you an assignment that's going to have us break down the preamble to the Constitution because it's brilliant. Now, after the preamble, there are 7 parts. The preamble is an introduction and preview of our core values as Americans. The first article, and again, these are some of the kind of questions I'm going to ask on the midterm. What does Article 1 of the Constitution talk about? Well, it talks about the legislative branch. The legislative branch in our country is called the House of Representatives and the Senate. There are actually two parts. That was one of the things that they had to debate and discuss at the Constitutional Convention. The small states wanted equal representation in Congress. The big states, and by big states I mean population-wise, wanted to have more power than the states that had less population because they have more people. And so they had to create a bicameral Congress. That was the compromise. The House of Representatives, every state gets representatives in the House based on the state's population. I'm going to teach that to you again and again and again, so the sooner you get that down, the better. The House of Representatives, it's the number of population of a state that determines the number of seats that you get. Every state gets at least one person in the House of Representatives. But by population, some states get a lot more. Let me just give you one example. The state of Alaska, the biggest state by far in the United States, gets only one person in the House of Representatives. But California has the biggest population, and we have more people that live in California than the entire country of Canada. And Canada is the world's second biggest country. So just take that into consideration. In California, we have 53 representatives in the House, okay, in Congress. And Alaska, 1. So you can see the population difference between Alaska and California. Every single state gets 2 senators. It doesn't matter the size or the population. Every state that's admitted gets 2 to the Senate. So when our country first started, there was 26, right? 13 original states. So 26 senators. And today, of course, we have 100 because we have 2 from every state and we have 50 states. So Article 1 goes over the legislative branch. I'm going to spend an entire week lecture just going over the legislative branch. The second article is the executive branch. That would be the president and the vice president. That would be also what we call the cabinet. When George Washington was made president, he hired Alexander Hamilton as his Secretary of Treasury. He hired Thomas Jefferson as his Secretary of State and Alexander Knox as his Secretary of War. Today we call that Secretary of Defense because it sounds a lot less aggressive. And he also hired an Attorney General. But today the cabinet has got a lot bigger and we have all kinds of different departments. And we'll spend at least an entire week just talking about the executive branch and the powers of the president. The third article of the Constitution talks about the judicial branch, and that's the legal court system. There is a federal court system. There are state court systems. There are appellate courts where people can appeal. The top court is called the Supreme Court, but the entire legal system is the judicial branch, and it has the power to review law. The executive branch has the power to execute the law or enforce the law, and of course the legislative branch has the power to make the laws. And out of all 3 branches, the Constitution spends the most time on the legislative branch. It spends a little bit less time on the executive branch and a little bit less time on the judicial branch. The last pieces of the Constitution, the fourth one is called Relations Among States. And because different states have different laws, there has to be some reciprocity, some things that go back and forth across state lines. In other words, if I got married in Utah, but now I live in California, I'm still legally married. And a death certificate in the state of Washington would be valid if you needed to use that with a company in Arizona and vice versa. But every state also gets to make some of its own laws, so we have to have some kind of coordination, relations among states. Also, if a territory wants to become a state, what are the qualifications? And that's what's gone over in the fourth. Okay, state must respect other states' laws and accept other states' legal documents, etc. And the qualifications for admissions of a new state is laid out in detail. The fifth one, and you might want to put a star by this one, it's one of the most important. Now, one of the most brilliant things that our founding forefathers did when they created the Constitution is they realized that they didn't know everything and that things were going to change, and that if they wanted the Constitution to last, and it has lasted lasted for over 200 years. They had to allow a little bit of wiggle room in order to change the document, to put additions onto the document as new things came up. The problem is if you make it too easy to change the Constitution, then people just do it in a heartbeat and nobody would respect the document. If you make it impossible, then it might break, it might snap, it might not work, the Constitution, because it has to be a little bit flexible. And so the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution allows for amendments to be added. So far, there are 27 amendments. So over 200 years, there's been 27 amendments. The first 10 were added right away. They're called the Bill of Rights. It takes 2/3 vote in the House and Senate to approve of the changes, and 3/4 of the states must accept the amendment. So it's not easy to change, but it is possible. There's only 27 amendments or changes to the Constitution in over 200 years. And some of those changes are huge and highly significant. Things like ending slavery, like women getting the right to vote, right? I mean, these are huge things. By the way, the 13th Amendment was the ending slavery. The 14th Amendment is granting citizenship to all people who are born inside the political boundaries of the United States. The 19th Amendment is the one that grants women the freedom to vote. I mean, there's all kinds of great amendments. There's a couple that were kind of not well received, but we'll talk about those ones later. The sixth one is called national supremacy. If you have states that have laws, and you have a federal government that oversees all of the states, which one trumps, the state laws or the federal laws? And the Constitution says federal government is the highest law of the land. So if a state law is in conflict with the federal law, the federal or national law wins. And the seventh article is called ratification, and they had to get enough states to sign it and accept it for the new government to be put into place. So the length of these articles starts big and gets smaller all the way to the bottom where they're just signing it. And it took a lot of work to convince the states to do it. But eventually, of course, we have the United States. And everything has been perfect since. No, it hasn't been. In fact, within 100 years, we're fighting the Civil War. And it still looks like we have issues if you ever watch the news. But I guess that's part of the human experience, right? Truth will ultimately prevail where there is pain taken to bring it to light. Again, I have this great little video embedded. I highly encourage you to check out the separation of powers. It's going to become a critical piece of this class. If we were sitting in class right now, I would show the video, but you can find my notes on my website and check it out. Please listen to this because I believe it is profound. Government is like a fire. If you don't have one, you'll freeze to death. But if you're not careful with it, it can burn you. If you don't tend it, if you don't keep it under control, it will consume everything. Guys, I need you to learn about your country and about the limitations that government has, because if you don't know that the government has limits, then it will keep taking, and you will lose your freedoms. Okay? Again, another great video that I would highly recommend if we were sitting in class. I'd be going over that. I want to talk about here, towards the end of this discussion this week, about 3 ways that we divide the power of government. One of the ways is federalism. And I'm going to spend an entire week talking about federalism, but in the first couple of weeks here, I'm introducing some topics about government. Federalism is dividing and sharing of power between the federal government and the state government. For instance, the federal government in Washington, D.C. will make certain laws that apply to all 50 states. But each state also gets to make some of its own laws. One of the greatest examples of states making their own laws is Las Vegas. People, by the thousands, drive up to Las Vegas on the weekend to go gambling. Why do they go up to Vegas to gamble? Because gambling is not legal in California. There's no casinos in California. Now, this is really interesting because I'm betting that some of you are sitting here watching this video and you're thinking, no, I know there's casinos in California, Mr. Moore. My parents have gone to them down the hill. Casino Moronga, is just one example. The thing is, there is Native American territory or Indian reservations in California. And the only place that casinos are allowed are on Indian territory or Indian land that happens to be within the state of California. In California, they call it Indian gaming. And so if you happen to find a casino in California, it's only because it's not in California. It's technically on a federal piece of land called an Indian territory or Indian reservation. I know that sounds kind of complicated, but in Nevada, they've chosen to have open gambling. And so each state gets to choose a lot of its own laws, okay? Laws can be on a national level, affecting all 50 states and territories, at a state level, just within the jurisdiction of a state, or they can even be local, like in Apple Valley. There's a town ordinance where you can't build more than 2 houses per acre. That's why in California, you find some places like Victorville where the houses are almost like on top of each other. But in Apple Valley, we always have at least a half acre of land, no matter where you're at in Apple Valley. That's one of the beauties of it, right? So you can have it at a county level or a state level. So that's called federalism, sharing power, dividing power. The other one is a checks and balance system. We have separate but equal branches to balance power. The legislative branch is called Congress, and it makes the laws. The executive branch is called the president, and it enforces the laws. And the judicial branch is called the Supreme Court, and it reviews the laws. And hopefully all those 3 branches are on equal ground. But I can tell you this, that over time, Congress has lost power and the president has gained power. The office of president used to not be as significant as it is now. The last way that we kind of divide power in our government is by groups of people with similar political ideas who form a party. And they make decisions on party lines. And having political parties is not a necessity. It's not even something. In fact, our first president, he gave a warning. George Washington, when he was leaving office, he gave a warning. And he said, do not allow factions to form in the government. And the word factions is the word political parties today. He said if you have factions or political parties that develop, they'll look out for their own self-interests and not for the interests of the nation. And so I think that's highly significant. George Washington, smart dude, first president. And I wish today there are hundreds of political parties, but the 2 major ones dominate. The Democrats and the Republicans are the ones that dominate. They get all the money, they get all the press. And if you vote for somebody who's not a major political party, it's almost like throwing your vote away. So I don't think it's necessarily a good thing. I have kind of discussed that, and I certainly will more. Again, some great videos that are embedded. So, bringing government and economics together. One of the things that we're going to be doing in this class is first semester we're going to be focusing on government, and then the other semester we're going to focus on economics. So 1 semester on government, 1 semester on economics, but sometimes they do tie together. Where does the government get money to spend? It comes from taxes. Taxes on tariffs, like imported goods, or income tax that they collect from the people. States collect it through sales tax. Everything's taxed. And sometimes students who are seniors understand this pain, and some of you don't yet. If you've ever had a real job, and I mean by real job where you get a paycheck from an actual legal company, you've noticed on your paycheck the amount of money that the federal government takes out in taxes, and you probably also noticed the amount of money that the state takes out. I remember when I was in between my junior and senior year, I was working at a meat factory on a kill floor, like killing cattle and pigs and stuff like that. And I got my first paycheck, and that's the first time I realized, like, oh yeah, there's 2 governments. There's the state government taking its chunk, and there's the federal government taking its chunk, and then there's Social Security, and then there's Medicaid and Medi-Cal, and then they're just taking out so much money by the time you're done. You're like, oh, I worked so hard. Where's my money going? Kind of a thing, you know? If the government makes the money, can't they just print more to get out of debt? If there's ever a chance for me to make a pun with my name, I will. So just get used to that. Isn't that interesting? We're going to talk in our economics class about something called inflation, where if you print more money, then the value of it decreases. and you can actually cause severe problems by printing more money. So even though our government is trillions of dollars in debt, and I think it's going to hit a wall pretty soon, depending on how long government shuts down. The economy is shutting down, especially during the whole COVID-19 coronavirus program. It's just unbelievable how much the government is spending with money they don't have. And if you print it and it becomes worthless, if we stop respecting that piece of paper with presidents and founding forefathers' faces on it, then there are some countries in the past where the paper money has become worthless because it's not respected. So we got to be very careful about how much money is printed by the government. So there's a little tie together with economics and how that works. Okay, so I'm going to probably stop right there because I don't really want to get into the Federalist Papers right now. The Federalist Papers are essays that were written by people like Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison to convince people to support the ideas found in the Constitution. But we're going to do some assignments and stuff on that later. And again, at the end of my notes, I always have some review videos. The only ones that are required will show up on Google Classroom or will be shown in class if we're physically in class. But that kind of concludes this lecture on the second week of school right here on the rights and responsibilities of citizens in a democracy. Thanks for participating. We'll talk to you guys later.